to discuss this time. And I'd like to just start by saying that there's no institution even remotely comparable to the United Nations as the most ideal global convener. I think this is stated at the end of his points. I think he's quite right, and he has presented to us a lot of things for us to seriously consider. Of course, the agenda for peace is something which is quite familiar to probably all of us. Former Secretary General Boutros Ghali presented the first agenda for peace in 1992. And 3 years afterwards, he amplified this agenda by a supplement, quite a substantial supplement. And opened to us a whole new horizon of new types and new problems for UN peacekeeping in relation to enforcement action as a development of peacekeeping as such. And so, in a sense, Mr. Guterres's presentation this time can be considered a development of a type which Boutros Ghali started. I'm sure that many of you here present, like myself, are very impressed by the huge, enormous scope of coverage by the current Secretary General of the United Nations. Certainly, UN is full of problems, but at the same time, I must agree with Secretary General that United Nations is by far the most ideal convener of new thinking about the problems we are faced with and we are going to face in the future. And so we should be at the same time very futuristic in our design of the future of the multilateralism in our world. But at the same time, I think we should be very realistic as to the challenges, problems, and difficulties which will be discouraging for all of us. So I look forward to listening very carefully to what all of you have to say, so that at this conclusion, we'll be at a new domain of a better understanding of what lies ahead of us with the full expectation that we are also have every reason to expect a better future for all of us here on the globe, among other things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Akashi, for your very profound remarks. Now I'd like to invite Professor Maruwala, who was appointed as Under Secretary General and the Rector of the United Nations University 6 months ago in March. Professor Maruwala, you have 5 minutes. Please start your remark.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And I feel honored that I am speaking after very excellent and enlightened remarks by Mr. Yasushi Akashi. I have been asked by Professor Hasegawa to follow you and speak, but only for 5 minutes. Therefore, my remarks will be brief, but I touch upon what was not of major concern for Boutros Ghali in his agenda for peace 30 years ago, which has been brought out as new and critically significant by Antonio Guterres in his new agenda for peace. That is the weaponization of new technologies and emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. Technology and warfare have been intrinsically linked throughout human history. From sharpened stones to atom splitting technologies to advance human existence, they have also been used for mass killings and destruction, as we witnessed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Rapidly advancing and converging technologies are already revolutionizing conflict dynamics in Ukraine and elsewhere. The proliferation of armed and crewed aerial systems, commonly known as drones, is rapidly advancing in armed conflict with increased use of varying degrees of sophistication by both state and non-state actors, including terrorists. And some of these drones actually are making decisions independent of human agency with devastating consequences. They have already been deployed against civilian targets, including office buildings, schools, and even hospitals. Furthermore, developments in artificial intelligence and quantum technologies related weapon systems are exposing the insufficiency of existing global governance frameworks. The magnitude of the artificial intelligence revolution has now descended upon us. Its potential for harm for societies, economies, and human existence itself is unpredictable and unimaginable. And of course, our Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, at the Security Council, indicated that he will support the establishment of a new UN agency that focuses on understanding artificial intelligence and ensuring that it is used for peace and prevention of conflicts rather than exacerbation of conflict. As stated in the new Agenda for Peace, page 28, artificial intelligence is both an enabling and disruptive technology increasingly integrated into a broad array of civilian, military, and dual-use applications, often with unforeseen implications and consequences. The increasing ubiquity of artificial intelligence, combined with its rapid scalability, lack of transparency, and pace of innovation poses potential risks to international peace and security and presents governance challenges. I may also add that the ease at which you can be able to distribute these technologies means it is much, much more easier to proliferate and difficult to control than, say, nuclear technology. But we have to find a governance framework that ensures that peace and security is assured. Member states should take steps to mitigate risks relating to artificial intelligence, enable systems in the peace and security domain, and develop the necessary frameworks to achieve these goals. To conclude my remarks in this limited time, I urge you, as Secretary General Antonio Guterres has done in his policy brief, to explore, formulate, and present to the United Nations and its member states concrete actions to prevent the weaponization of emerging technologies and promote their responsible application. More specifically, we should examine and propose how the United Nations can embark upon the task of preventing state and non-state terrorist groups from misusing new technologies to plan attacks, including cyber attacks. Thank you, and I look forward to your deliberations. And as we say it here in Tokyo, arigato gozaimashita.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maruwala, for delivering a very important message only you can make about the potential benefits and danger of rapidly developing artificial intelligence. Now, I have a pleasure to invite Mr. Renato Mariani, Political Affairs Officer of the Department of Political and Peace-Building Affairs, who played a major role in drafting the new Agenda for Peace. Mr. Mariani, please explain how the new Agenda for Peace was formulated and what is the central message. You have 8 to 10 minutes. Mr. Mariani.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and good evening and good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join such a distinguished list of speakers. So my name is Renato Mariani. I'm the head of the Policy Planning Unit of the PPA, which was the unit that led the development of a new Agenda for Peace and coordinated with the other parts of the UN system, especially our co-leads in the Department of Peace Operations, Disarmament Affairs, and Counterterrorism. And in the brief time we have today, I thought I would focus a little bit on the rationale behind the preparation of this document and the choices that we made in developing it. As Mr. Kashi said in the beginning in his presentation, I think immediately when the Secretary General gave us this task, our mind went to the original Agenda for Peace in 1992. And reading it and reading the records of the meetings and the Security Council meeting, the first meeting at the head of state level that the Security Council had at the time, we noticed how different the global environment was then from today. If you read those statements and the document, they are very optimistic documents and statements. There was a very optimistic sense of hope that the international community after the end of the Cold War could come together for new ways of implementing multilateral action for peace. And obviously, the moment that we have today is a very different one. There's a sense of pessimism, there's a sense of competition, and a lot of member states, when we started to develop this document, asked us, why are you doing this now, given the difficulty of the current environment, which for us is exactly the reason why this document is so needed today. But there's clearly a very different type of approach and different type of international environment in the original Agenda for Peace and the new one. But one thing that they had in common, which I think is what guided our preparation of this document, that they both came at particular moments where we felt there was a change in the global order. As I mentioned, the Agenda for Peace came at the end of the Cold War. The new Agenda for Peace is coming at the moment where, as the Secretary General says in the document, we are in a transition to a new global order, to a more multipolar order, and that moment of transition carries a number of risks. And our goal was really to address those risks. The instructions we received from the Secretary General were to be ambitious but pragmatic in preparing this document. So it seeks to be very clear-eyed about the magnitude of today's challenges, but also realistic about potential solutions. Because of that, it is a document that is primarily about member state action. It is not as many UN documents about internal reforms and about changing divisions and restructuring the UN internally, because we all felt that the magnitude of challenges that we all face today can only be tackled by member state action primarily. Our central goal in developing this document was to put forward a unifying vision for peace and security, and we wanted to address the concerns and priorities of different constituencies. We wanted, as we're entering a world order in which there are a larger set of countries that want to play a more active role, as we are entering a moment where there's more mistrust amongst member states about multilateralism, we felt that it was critical to have a common and coherent narrative that they could all share. And I think based on the reactions that we received, we've achieved that to some extent. This document was prepared on the basis of extensive consultations with member states, with regional organizations, with civil society, and we listened to really as many different points of view as we could. We thought it was useful, and the first half of the document really presents this to offer an extensive narrative of the current global moment, about this transition in a global order that I mentioned and what it means for multilateralism. And ultimately, at the center, that narrative makes the case that member states, sort of, even if they're entering an era of greater competition, they are facing a set of global challenges that cannot be addressed by member states individually. They require international cooperation. Climate change, the activities of criminal groups, terrorism, the spread of deadly viruses. These are all issues that need to be tackled through international cooperation. And so the new Agenda for Peace really makes a case for how member states can move beyond a logical competition to embrace cooperation for shared interests. Not to abandon their national interests, but to recognize that they have shared interests. To underpin this vision, we developed these three concepts that came really in discussions with member states that underpin the whole set of recommendations, which are the concepts of trust, solidarity, and universality. And they, from our perspective, the lack of adherence and respect to these principles lie at the root of some of the problems we have today, the kind of how trust between member states has been gradually eroded, and how that has led to significant challenges in a number of places. And that solutions must be built on them. At a strategic level, the new Agenda for Peace offers a vision for from the Secretary General for a more effective multilateral system. That vision, in essence, reiterates some basic principles of international cooperation, because one message we heard consistently from our counterparts was that idea that the new Agenda for Peace should go back to the basics. That was a line we heard very often, that it should talk about the centrality of the UN Charter, about diplomacy, about the need to rebuild the mechanisms that existed to manage disputes and improve trust among major powers, and which have gradually eroded, about regional frameworks, but also about the centrality of national action. And there's in the middle of the document, there's an extensive section about the Secretary General's vision that really goes into details about those. One, I think, particular difference between a new Agenda for Peace and the original Agenda for Peace is how strong the language in this new document is about women's equal participation and gender equality. I think, I don't remember the exact number, but the original Agenda for Peace refers to women maybe 5 or 6 times. It's a very it's a very narrow focus on security. And a new Agenda for Peace deliberately has, I think, some of the strongest language the Secretary General has used in this area in a peace and security document. And so it was on the basis of these sort of strategic vision and these common principles that we developed the 12 areas in the document, and those that are sort of distributed across the 5 clusters. I won't go into detail about them. You all have the document, but they organize around these 5 major clusters about addressing strategic risks and geopolitical divisions, preventing conflict and violence, sustaining peace, strengthening peace operations, addressing, as the director of UNU just mentioned, the risks of technology, the misuses of technology and their potential for conflict. And finally, what we call strengthening international governance, which was really about reform of intergovernmental bodies. And then all of these actions, there is a very strong message across the document about how they are supposed to support and buttress the SDGs, which we felt it was critical to integrate them in the document. I think the positive, we've received so far a very positive reaction from member states from very different groups. I think our idea was that we didn't want any group to be completely happy with the document. We wanted to have enough sort of recommendations in the document that appeal to the concerns of different groups of member states. And I think member states have recognized that is the case. In the couple of minutes that I have left, I just wanted to highlight 2 or 3 sort of substantive issues that are very important from the perspective of my department, DPPA, but also for the UN at large, and where I think the document has very strong messages. The first is diplomacy. A new agenda for peace really has a broad approach to diplomacy at the global level. It really tries to make the case for diplomacy as a tool to manage this era of divisions that we're entering. And it may not sound new, but we are really entering this. We're seeing a dangerous retrenchment of diplomacy, and so there's a very strong message about how diplomacy is needed, especially amongst countries that do not think alike. But also not only diplomacy to resolve and prevent conflict, but also diplomacy to bridge the fractures that we see that are not necessarily immediately related to conflict, but could lead to more tension. So fractures in economy, finance, in trade, in the internet, and we're seeing growing divisions there. And there's a strong message about the role of the Secretary General to kind of try to bridge those divides. The second is really the universality of prevention. I think that's one of the more paradigm shifts that we propose, is this idea that prevention should be seen as a universal goal, that every single member state needs to address prevention according to its own priorities, that every country faces risks not only of conflict but violence, and we have this message about addressing not only conflict-related violence but all forms of violence, and calling on each member state to address to develop prevention strategies. And we feel like this is an important shifting paradigm that hopefully will help address some of the stigma that surrounds prevention sometimes, that is seen as something that only applies to a subset of countries. Every country is facing different kinds of risks. And finally, really, I wanted to mention intergovernmental reform. I think there are strong messages there about Security Council reform, and it goes beyond just the Secretary General's call for reform, for member states to agree on reform of the membership of the Council, but also addresses issues that we felt were really important, like the methods of work of the Council, how the Council is addressing sanctions regimes, and how sanctions regimes should be changed to become a little bit more politically viable and focused on political solutions. Strong messages on the role of the General Assembly and revitalizing the General Assembly, particularly in the area of disarmament. And then we see a strong potential in the role of the Peacebuilding Commission, and there really are strong messages about strengthening the PBC, which we hope to carry forward, especially as we enter the review of the peacebuilding architecture in 2025. Obviously, this is a very broad document. I didn't address other areas that are really critical, like nuclear non-proliferation, disarmament, new technologies. We would need much more time to discuss that. And I think that's kind of one of the really strengths of this document, especially compared to 1992, is that it is a broader, more holistic vision of peace and security. And that was deliberately so. We wanted to present a document that did not only address our role, particularly related to peacekeeping and peace operations, but that addressed it across the whole conflict spectrum and across all the different issues that the UN is facing in this area. And just to conclude, really, the set of actions that we propose are really designed to answer one simple question, which is, what would it take in this area that is more fragmented and more fractious for cooperation to win over competition amongst member states? And we feel like we try to present a vision that for member states to achieve that, and with a very strong message about the role of the UN as a one organization that every member state can trust and should trust, and that is the global organization that can play a role here. I'll stop here. I hope I stayed within my allotted time, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mariani, for your informative explanation. I now invite Mr. Robert Berg, distinguished scholar and member of the Academic Council of the United Nations System and the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Mr. Berg, you have 8 to 10 minutes. Please,
Thank you
George.
very much.
Thank
It's a high honor to be among you and to be invited by our eminent friend, Professor Hasegawa. And I'm very grateful and congratulate Mr. Mariami for his presentation and for his product, which has covered some very important areas, particularly this role of diplomacy. Yeah. But let me start with three kind of sobering observations from someone who is not as close to the action as many of you, so forgive me if I am not quite correct. First, I believe the United Nations is losing market share. If one could measure the quantity of global governments, I believe the UN's share has been declining. Financially, it is stable to declining in most budgets. For example, resources for UN peacekeeping has declined or flatlined since 2015 and is now in real terms about 30% less than 8 years ago. In terms of memberships, there are now 20 countries lined up to become members of the BRICS, and the G20 continues to have growth in the breadth of their substantive agenda and in terms of heads of state interest, as we now see in the G20 summit to take place in 3 weeks. Second, the P5 wants competent but not dynamic changemakers in its top UN leadership. Some years ago, Sir Brian Urquhart, the acknowledged historian of the UN, and I counted up 13 in the UN's history who were truly dynamic changemakers in UN leadership. People who launched serious and fundamental initiatives who sometimes changed history. Naturally, Dag Hammarskjöld was first on his list. Everyone agrees on Hammarskjöld, but no great power wants another one. I saw quiet power being exercised so strongly, by the way, by Mrs. Ogata during many meetings of the Chief Executives Board meetings that I attended. And potentially the dynamic leader to watch now is Ajay Banga at the World Bank. Third observation, the constraints on the Secretary General are considerable. I well remember a former Secretary General launching some peacekeeping reforms and then being really chastised by the then president of the UN General Assembly for announcing changes without first getting his okay. Secretary General Guterres has done the best he can in creating the new agenda. He has checked with all the relevant powers in and outside the UN, and what he has proposed, I'm sure, is less than what he wanted, but it reflects what he can get. I believe these points influence what we have in the new agenda. In fact, it is bold because it took courage for the Secretary General to acknowledge that some of the UN's key peacekeeping work is failing. And it took courage to say the real action on peace is outside of the UN. To me, these are noteworthy points and they create actual opportunities. First, the key point that the Secretary General very correctly observed is that the focus of peace must be on national capacities and institutions, the architecture of peace at the national level. The SG's description of this architecture is perhaps a little more limited than it should be. So perhaps we can fill in some of the blanks by noting that a vibrant national peace architecture should include dedicated governmental functions, academic training, forecasting, building up of civil society, security sector reform most often, and influencing the culture through campaigns and through curricular reforms that could perhaps keep the old histories but add to them the victories of peaceful settlement and collegial work in societies. These are ambitious and these are expensive features to add to national governance. But the answer is a limited one in the new agenda. The Secretary General says, let us add financing of national architectures and infrastructures to the UN peace funding's mandates, along with a new mandate to address climate and peace challenges. Those are two big additions with zero new resources. As you know, the fund is flatlined at about $170 million a year, a very small amount for any of its mandates. Colleagues and I have been working on what an adequate funding mechanism would be for addressing the challenges of peace architectures, institutions, and operations. We are testing the concept of creating a new multilateral fund like Gavi and the Global Fund that fights 3 diseases. This would be an international peace-building fund, neutrally located, perhaps jointly in Geneva and Singapore, and staffed with experts who demonstrate real social entrepreneurship skills. My paper goes into more details about this proposed fund. The bottom line is that the Secretary General knows he should design an elephant, but his authority limits his design to that of a small mouse. Dynamic leaders would not let this situation be the final word. They might well organize international expertise to create new funding mechanisms. They might use their convening power to engage sources of global wealth to support new ways to fund peace. And they would not treat this as just one of a few hundred priorities, but as a key part of their legacy. The second courageous acknowledgement of the Secretary General is getting a good deal of attention. His focus is on the deficits of UN peacekeeping in Africa. He proposes that African regional and sub-regional strengths be utilized to take up peacekeeping with regular UN financial support. One must agree that something serious must be done, and there are few options. The old colonial powers want out. The new colonial power, Russia, may actually be less involved in Africa now that the Wagner Group is beginning to dissolve. But from my perhaps incorrect perspective, after 10 years as senior advisor to the UN Economic Commission for Africa, turning to the African Union is not a panacea. Its record is not excellent, and it needs strengthening on the peace side of peacekeeping. ECOWAS is in better shape. Offloading peacekeeping will have some applicability in Africa, but none in the other regions where the regional organizations are not well organized to manage peace. Even in Europe, this is true, as there is no reliable European peacekeeping operation to assume duty in, for example, Cyprus, where $57 million a year is spent on UN peacekeepers whose force has been on duty for an astonishing 59 years without a political solution. And that is so superior to Myanmar and other places where the responsibility to protect is not being instituted. Perhaps dynamic actions could do something on these issues, perhaps nothing. But maybe the Secretary General could use his good offices to encourage countries to actually build up regional organizations, acting as a friend and champion for the growth of regional and perhaps sub-regional political organizations, making peer learning available from UN experts to regional functions. This will be a long process, but it could be a vital step to foster a multipolar world of regional political power as opposed to merely yielding to the biggest national powers in regions. I believe Asia has one of the greatest needs for this aggregation of effective power vested in well-balanced regional organizations. So my bottom line, the UN is weak but vital. It can't be substituted by groups like the G20 and BRICS that have no professional depth. The Secretary General has proposed a number of doable incremental improvements. My paper lists these and adds some other doable ideas. Uppermost in my mind of the set of proposals is to empower the Peace-Building Commission to have much greater importance and to be able to relieve a lot of the work of the Security Council. But the Peace-Building Commission itself needs reform so that it can act in a much more expeditious manner. I feel particularly strongly that the UN now needs to start getting approval and start implementing the doable ideas. Each such improvement will add to the credibility of this weakened institution. I would never start the improvements with the hardest and least likely tasks, which to my mind is changing the composition of the Security Council. Let that come fourth or fifth in line. But the key point is to start the reforms. The results will be incremental. They need to be followed and publicized so that the UN is again seen as a place where humanity finds solutions and effectiveness. The Secretary General must encourage the end of useless programs and concentrate on the key issues, and none is more important than peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bilk, for your very analytic explanation on the agenda for peace. We will now start the panel discussion with former senior officials of the UN system and non-profit organizations that are monitoring the UN system. I ask each speaker to make his or her views in 5 minutes. But before that, let me just remind you that we have this circulating materials about this agenda, new agenda for peace, and then the papers are presented, written by the
You're
Come on,
muted.
Tessa, muted.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you very much, Mr. Bell, for your analytic explanation about the new agenda for peace. As Mr. Bell indicated that his paper is in a circulated background material file, page 16 to 24, which one I will share with you in the chat section soon. Then I will now start the panel discussion with former senior officials of the UN system and non-profit organizations that are monitoring the UN system. I ask each speaker to make his or her views in 5 minutes. The first speaker is Mr. Georgios Kostakos from Greece. He is currently executive director of the Brussels-based Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability. Mr. Kostakos, please, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kumagai. It's an honor, of course, for me to be here and a great opportunity to share with you my views. I very much enjoyed the previous presentations. I wanted to also tell you that the Peacemaking Reflection Group, a group of former UN staff, of which I'm a member, and we have a few more members here, had an input into this new agenda for peace. We sent our contribution within the deadlines, and we are acknowledged on the new agenda for peace website as having done so. I draw on those proposals and also on my own experience from the UN to make my critique of the new agenda for peace. We heard from Mr. Mariani what was the reason for and the rationale and the basis for this. And I understand that this new agenda for peace very rightly brings in all the aspects of threats to security that we're facing today, which are not only military or traditional peace and security threats, but also have to do with development, sustainable development, big challenges like climate and pandemics, etc. Plus, of course, the technological threats that we hear from the UN Directorate and more. So the thing is that the agenda for peace, the first one that Boutros Boutros-Ghali proposed after an invitation by the Security Council to do so, did focus on what the UN could do and on classical peace and security aspects of it. What we don't see here, I'm afraid that stating philosophically the interconnection of challenges without really getting into detail on what the UN can do, and the UN can do a lot more under the current framework and rules that exist, and it's not doing that. For example, Article 99 of the Charter, where the Secretary General can bring to the attention of the members of the Security Council any threat to the peace, in his opinion, that threatens international peace and security, is not being used. There are no fact-finding missions or major mediation efforts, envoys, etc. So it is a bit of a theoretical text, this agenda, new agenda for peace. It's something that member states, of course, will consider with due respect, but I'm afraid that it misses this connection to the reality of the UN today. And when I hear that the UN is getting weaker, yes, but who allows it to get weaker when we don't use the political capital accumulated over decades, including through Dan Hammarskjöld and Brian Urquhart and others, when we don't use this political capital to try to get a solution to the Russia-Ukraine war, to the Yemen war, to other Sudan and other conflicts. We cannot pass the bucket to offload the responsibility to regional organizations where regional differences can also make things worse, like we see now in the case of Niger, where you have the regional bloc possibly splitting, supporting one or the other side. So the UN has a unique role. It is the only guardian of overall peace and stability, and therefore cannot hand over this role. Plus, the convening role of the UN has not been used, is not being used, in my opinion, as it could have been for the response to the pandemic, etc. So when Mr. Bergs talks about a new separate facility for peace building, I see it as a weakening of the UN, like also COVAX was, this multi-stakeholder approach that in a way privatizes functions of the UN without having the scrutiny, but also the accountability and the legitimacy of the UN proper. Finally, I see that a better approach, and I hope that the new addendum or something like Boutros-Ghali did comes out from the Secretary General and his office, is that we see the pure military or classical peace and security threats interconnected with human security threats. Human security needs another approach, and we have proposed, as FOGS, my organization, a global resilience council for that purpose that deals with climate and other issues and brings together the UN system and the global governance system to address them properly. We cannot securitize them, we don't need to. And SDGs, of course, and all that, while a proper new agenda for peace says exactly what the UN can do with the current resources and current legislative framework. And there is a lot more that can be done. The Peace Building Commission can also be improved, but only in this framework, cannot take over all aspects. Peace, building peace within countries, within regions, and the whole world is a very important preventive action and a very concrete one, but it has to be part of a broader architecture and cannot replace the human security threats and the work that needs to be done on that side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Georgios Kostakos, for your very informative findings and analysis. I now wish to request Dr. Jose Victor da Silva Angelo of Portugal, who served as the Special Representative of the Secretary General and head of the United Nations mission in the Central African Republic and Chad, Dr. Victor Angelo. Please, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I was indeed a special representative also in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, and before that I spent like Suke Asegawa quite a number of years, several decades, working with UNDP, and I was resident coordinator, resident representative, and humanitarian coordinator in different parts of the world. So I have seen the UN system for many years. I have worked within the UN system for many years, and I have seen the different dimensions of the system. So my first comment about this new agenda is that we should be positive. We should be able to consider this document as a constructive contribution to the reflection about the world of today and I would even say the world of tomorrow, what is coming in our direction. So my first recommendation is that, notwithstanding all the criticism that we might have, the starting point should be a positive one. This is a very dense document. Is a very good basis for discussion, for reflection, and certainly raises some very important issues about the major threats for peace. However, one major threat as far as the future of peace is concerned is not clearly mentioned in the agenda, in the draft agenda, which is the competition and the rivalry between superpowers. And this is certainly, in my opinion, one of the most dangerous situations that we have in front of us. We cannot ignore that there is an extreme competition between 2, 3, 4 superpowers, and this competition might sooner or later lead to a situation where there is no peace to keep, where there is no peace in the world. And that has very important implications, not only for the countries concerned, but for entire regions of the world. And I think this kind of competition and rivalry between superpowers should be clearly mentioned with diplomacy, of course, with the right words, but should be clearly mentioned in the document. So that's one of the things I want to refer to. And the other thing is that the document puts quite a lot of emphasis on the Peace Building Commission and the Peace Building Fund and the need to strengthen the Commission and increase the resources of the fund. But we have serious doubts about the usefulness of this mechanism. I was actually in the late 90s and the early 2000s, one of those in New York discussing the establishment of such a commission. We had invested quite a lot of hope in the commission, and what we have seen 23 years later is that the Peace Building Commission has not met the expectations. We certainly are not satisfied with the way it has dealt with post-conflict situations, and it has only become just one window, one more financial window to finance projects. And I don't think that's good enough. And in many ways, it's nowadays means to give some resources to the new established resident coordinators functions. And that I have another problem, which is that the separation, the split of the function of the resident coordinator from the UN UNDP resident representative is, in my opinion, a very serious mistake, and it has reduced the strength and the capacity of intervention, have reduced the leverage of the UN at the country level, and many resident coordinators have almost no capacity to play a political role in the countries that they serve. And that was not the case when this function was performed simultaneously with the function of resident representative of UNDP. So that is, in my opinion, one of the serious matters that the Secretary General has decided upon and needs to be looked at again, because we have to make sure, if we are talking about peace, we have to make sure that the presence of the UN system in the different countries is as strong as possible. And that brings also to another issue, which is not just the presence at the country level that needs to be strengthened again, and make sure that the representative system at the country level is able to play a political role that is expected from the UN. But we have also to make sure that at the global level, the UN plays a much stronger role in the political arena. One of the things we have seen in the last few years is a decrease of the capacity of the UN to play a major role in terms of peace, global peace and peace initiatives. From a major actor in the area of global peace, the UN has become almost a forgotten actor, and that should be also addressed in this new agenda for peace. And that brings me to another issue, which is the issue of lead or facilitate. The agenda for peace as drafted today is basically giving the UN a facilitating role, when in reality, and in my opinion, and based on my experience, both roles should belong to the UN. Where we can lead, we should lead. Where we can take the initiative, we should take the initiative. And where we cannot do that, we should at least try to facilitate and make sure that the different actors that have authority and power do contribute to bring back peace and make sure that the situation of conflict is resolved. Actually, the agenda for peace, as it is drafted now, is very much based on conflicts within states and not conflicts between states or among states. And we have nowadays a situation where conflicts between states are becoming more and more a major risk, and we have to take that into account as well. We cannot just look at things from a national or a country perspective. We have also to look at them from a more global or a more regional perspective. I like the idea of mentioning the African Union and the support to the African Union in different areas, particularly in the area of peace operations. What we know about what they have done in the area of peace operations is not very good, and is certainly not very productive. We have to look at that very carefully. But we are not only talking about the African Union, we are also talking about other regional associations in other parts of the world. We should not just focus on Africa, because that gives the impression that Africa is the continent of conflicts and everybody else in the other parts of the world has no problems with peace and are peaceful countries and so on and so forth. Then, if you allow me just a few more minutes, and I will be very brief, there was the UN Charter in 1945, There was the Boutros Ghali Agenda for Peace in '92. There is now the Antonio Guterres new Agenda for Peace. This new Agenda for Peace should reflect the world of today and try to put the emphasis on the need to reform the UN, including the UN Charter, to be able to respond to the challenges of today and tomorrow. And one of the major challenges that needs to be addressed and needs to be mentioned clearly is the reform of the Security Council. If there is one thing that I would do if I were the Secretary General, is to spend my days every day talking about the need to reform the Security Council and to make sure that the Security Council reflects the world of 2023 or 2024 and not the world of 1945. So this is also something that I would like to mention. And just to add one more point, and then I will leave you to think about these things. There is a need to look again at the peace operations and the performance of the peace operations. What's happening with the peace operations in Mali, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, even in Central Africa, in Haiti, and so on and so forth, shows that there is a very serious undermining of the peace operations and the UN work in this area, and this needs to be revised. I know that the new agenda talks about the need to link peace operations with political agendas and political objectives, and that's very, very important. Of course, that was part of the reform document that was published a few years ago, but still there is a need to look at peace operations again, look at the role of the host country and how the UN should relate with the country that is hosting the operation. And that's a very serious problem. What we have seen, for instance, in Mali or in Chad, where the countries have asked simply for the missions to go. This needs to be reflected, and some kind of responses, institutional responses, should be prepared for this kind of positions by countries that do that kind of requests. Also, we have to look at the civilian staff in the peace operations and look at a cultural revolution within the civilian staff, because we know from different sources that there are some serious problems with the way the civilian staff operate, recruit, relate among themselves, introduce ethnicity and regionalism in the missions, and so on and so forth. And that's something that needs to be looked at very, very carefully. And there is a need, there is a need, therefore, for instance, to do a proper audit of the civilian recruitments in the missions, because I think there is a serious problem in some missions in terms of the way people from the civilian side are recruited. There is no clear reference in the document to human security. I would spend a little bit more time on that, a few more lines on human security, because human security is so much related with human rights, with good governance, that we cannot forget that dimension. So that's another observation. And finally, having said that and looked at the recommendations for action, we could make some comments about some of the recommendations, including the first one, elimination of nuclear weapons. But I think during the discussion, we can come back to this. So that's what I would say at this stage. And many thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Victor Angelo, for your very incisive analysis. Next, I wish to inform you that the next panelist, Madame Kerstin Leitner of Germany, hoped to participate in this meeting, but she had to travel today. So Madame Leitner, who was UN resident coordinator and representative in China, had written her comments as her paper, which appears in background material, page 25 to 26. You can take a look at it, and then now Mr. Hillel Loh will kindly summarize her points. Mr. Hillel Loh, could you please summarize Madame Leitner's point?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Magai. I will now summarize the points made by Ms. Leitner in her paper. Ms. Leitner emphasizes the urgency of aligning international relations with the UN's Charter's principle. She critiques the current draft of the new Agenda for Peace for lacking a comprehensive strategy to implement these principles effectively, in particular with regards to the conflicts in Ukraine and Sudan. She recalls that the UN was established after World War II and is anchored in resolving conflict through dialogue, mediation, and negotiation through Chapter 6 of the UN Charter. And she argues that we need to see massive investment into a national and international peace architecture geared towards protecting human security. Ms. Leitner suggested that Germany and Japan, while not immediately demanding permanent seats on the Security Council, should lead discussion on broadening the Council's representation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hillel Loh. Next, I have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Zhang Guifeng, Distinguished Professor and Executive Director at the Center for UN Studies at Fudan University, China. He is a highly regarded scholar of independent mind and contributed his views to the widely read report entitled UN Security Council Reform: What the World Thinks, compiled by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Please access this report, which appears as background material number 7. Dr. Guifeng, could you please read your paper?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. It is my great pleasure to participate in the online discussion today. My thanks go to Professor Hasegawa for your invitation. 1 month ago, the United Nations Secretary General Guterres presented a new agenda for peace. This reminds us that 31 years ago, Secretary General Boutros Ghali presented an agenda for peace. So both peace agendas were presented at a big turning point in the world and in history. And both set out a vision of peace and a path of action to achieve it for a new era, a new world, and a new order. The new agenda for peace is not significant. If we consider the reforms of the peace and security framework undertaken by the Secretary General a few years ago, the new agenda for peace has the potential to become the future political legacy of the Secretary General Guterres, just as the Sustainable Development Agenda is one of the political legacies of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. The new agenda for peace is a preparation for the Summit for Future next year, and for the 80th anniversary of the United Nations the year after. And will lay the groundwork for the development of the United Nations over the next 20 years or so, leading up to the organization's 100th anniversary. The new agenda for peace makes it clear that the post-Cold War period is over and that there is a transition to a new order. So in this new era and order, the United Nations does need a new vision of peace and new ways to achieve it. The three principles of the collective security system, the 14 points of vision of multilateralism, and the 12 recommendations for action put forward by the new agenda provided the basis and the direction for discussion at the Summit for Future next year. Because of time constraint, I may not be able to give a detailed comment on the specifics of the new agenda. Instead, I want to say that the world is at a crossroads. Likewise, the United Nations is also at a crossroads. So not only do we need a new peace agenda, we need a new United Nations. Therefore, I very much look forward to the next policy brief on the United Nations 2.0. To my personal understanding, the United Nations needs to be transformed with a new mission, new functions, and renewed institutions. First, the mission of the United Nations has to be transformed from preventing world wars to responding to global issues. History since the end of the World War II has shown again and again the United Nations is unable to prevent wars of aggression by major powers, including but not limited to P5, against the small and medium-sized countries. Nor is the United Nations a decisive factor in preventing the occurrence and escalation of conflicts between major powers. The role of the United Nations in resolving internal conflicts within a country is also very limited. Therefore, the mission of the United Nations is likely to be changed to address various global challenges. These global challenges are neither purely peace and security programs, nor purely economic problems, but are transnational human social problems. Second, the functions of the United Nations also need to be transformed from international cooperation to global governance, from coordinating sovereign states to serving for the people of the world, and from national interests to human values. Last, certain organs of the United Nations need to be reformed or renewed. There is a consensus among member states that the Security Council needs to be reformed. However, there is a great deal of disagreement on how it should be reformed. It is difficult to reform the Council substantially in the near future. Why not we start with what is easy to reform? For example, that is to reform the Trusteeship Council, one of the 6 main organs of the United Nations, because the mission of the Trusteeship Council has been accomplished and its functions no longer exist. But after nearly 30 years, this body continues to exist. So the replacement of the Trusteeship Council by the Human Rights Council is one option. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Guihong, for your perspective that is Chinese, but also your own. I'm sure that there will be some questions addressed to you. Now I invite the final panel speaker, Ambassador Frank Martin O'Donnell, who served the United Nations for more than 30 years as UN Residence Coordinator for Ukraine, and also as in Serbia and Montenegro. Ambassador O'Donnell, you have 5 minutes. Please start your remark.
Well, thank you very much. I want to, first of all, thank
Dr. Hasegawa for facilitating my participation in this event, and express particular appreciation to the previous speakers for their very, very enlightening perspectives on the new agenda for peace. When I look at this document, there's much that one can find in it which is worthy of praise, as others have already spoken. But I will try to focus on a number of things where I think as a world community, in fact, as a world civilization, we need to be moving forward. And I would say, quite frankly, that when the UN was founded in 1945, it was really just the blueprint. The Charter was a blueprint for a planetary future, a sort of global civilization, which is very much in the making now in the 21st century. Yet we do not have the institutions and the processes of collective governance that would make that truly effective. One of the biggest problems that we have is corruption. And I think the new agenda for peace does not tackle the problem of corruption strongly, or perhaps even at all, really. Because if we look at the cycle of violence in this world, from conflict, localized conflicts, community urban conflict, and even national conflicts, intranational and international conflicts, we see that a lot of this is driven by decision makers, politicians, if you wish, who basically are not always accountable to the people to whom they should be accountable, an electorate or a society as such. There is therefore a very strong linkage between corruption, autocracy, the reduction of civic society, the reduction of human rights, and the empowerment of those forces that act irresponsibly to deprive people of their rights and, in fact, to reap resources through warlordism of various types. So I would talk about a cycle that links crime and corruption to autocracy, the diminishing of human rights, civil society, and conflict ultimately. Therefore, the point really is we have to tackle corruption on a global scale in every country. The UN Convention Against Corruption is lamentably under-implemented when we look at the national performance, as Transparency International and others continuously point out. We have to deal with the problem of corruption. You will not have accountable leadership if you have too much corruption. In fact, you have state capture and regime capture, and we need to stop that. It's the only way in which we can actually empower civil society, which is what the new agenda for peace speaks about. How do we empower civil society? We cannot do it unless we tackle this problem of corruption. And I think tackling corruption and the empowering of civil society, rendering leadership accountable, is the one greatest way forward to building a future world community with proper systems of governance and so forth. Now, on the actual problem of, I think, the non-state actors, which has been brought up by other speakers, this is very important. Civil society would be one. Corporations are another, multinational corporations in particular. And I think we need to see a situation where there is a proper regime of governance and regulatory governance of the corporate sector, the private sector, but also the parastatal state-owned companies across the world, many of which come from Asia and not just from the United States. In terms of resources, I think some mention was made of a peace building fund. It's a good idea, but we haven't touched on the issue of how to resource our global governance better. One thing that I would like to draw attention to is the BEPS, the base erosion provisioning with the OECD G20 inclusive framework on the BEPS 2.0, which will bring about a minimum effective tax rate of 15% on corporations, is a potentially significant source of resources for the Sustainable Development Goals, but also for the UN system itself. So these are just some of the remarks I would like to make. I think civic education is very important as well. And in the context of corruption and resource extraction, I think that a lot can be done by following the model of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, an organization which brings together civil society, government, and the mining sector to have a more transparent approach to resource extraction. And this is very important because we all know about the resource curse in the developing world and how the richness of resources, whether it's oil or gold, has, through corruption and theft, been actually a source of blood and conflict in many countries, whether we're talking Sudan, Niger, or blood diamonds in Angola or elsewhere. So the EITI is a very important initiative that needs broader recognition. And as a global governance structure, bringing in civil society, the private sector, and country governments, it could actually have some lessons for the UN process of reform and for the new agenda for peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador O'Donnell and other speakers, for your valuable contributions. Lastly, but not the least, I'd like to acknowledge with pleasure and honor the presence of Mr. Peter Schumann, former Acting Deputy Joint Special Representative of UNAMID in Darfur, former Acting Deputy Joint Special Representative in UNAMID in Darfur, and Mr. Jordan Ryan, Vice President for Peace Progress at the Carter Center, and Mr. Mats Karlsson, former Vice President of the World Bank and Director of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you very much for your presence. I now close the panel session and take 30 seconds before we start the second part of our meeting today. The second part will be the exchange of views and opinions with external speakers and key members of the Global Peace Building Association of Japan and Kyoto Peace Building Center, as well as other participants. For this purpose, I request Professor Hasegawa to moderate the session.
And I invite the people to raise your hands. And yes, I acknowledge Ambassador Shinyo first, and then Professor Veselin Popovsky and others. Ambassador Shinyo, how did you find the presentation by Renato and some of the comments made by the speakers? Could you just keep it at most 2 to 3 and express your views? Ambassador Shinyo, you have 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Hasegawa, and thank you very much, all the speakers. It was very interesting. I have read, of course, the document and also have carefully listened to what you have said. I couldn't help, the feeling that this paper is very well written, but very boring and lack of a sense of urgency. And also, I think the proposal put forward was business as usual. We have already heard those kind of things somewhere. And also, a little banal. I'm sorry, very, very sorry for my frankness. And so there are so many narratives or cliches, the importance of diplomacy or importance of, the collaboration and so on and so forth. That's true, of course. Everybody can say this, but the problem is how? At the time where there is no hope or little hope in comparison to the 30 years ago. So we should have a brand new modus vivendi or modus operandi, but those are lacking. And this is my the general remarks and general feeling that I have felt. So it could be a basis for discussion for the member states, but it could be not be a the good basis for the discussion. So somebody said that the addendum or supplement to the report might become necessary. And what I most think lacking is that the very concrete proposal with regard to the Security Council. I'm not talking about the reform itself, but the operation of the management of the Security Council, the many countries, including also the permanent 3 or so, propose that the veto must be used very carefully. And I think those could be perhaps shared by many countries, but this point is not well taken into consideration. It seems to be the case that the Secretariat or the Secretary General itself has some reservation, hesitation. It is too modest. For whom he has such kind of the feeling, hesitation. And also the very well famous Article 27, paragraph 3 should be taken into consideration and discussed more into detail. The party to the conflict, in case of the peaceful resolution of the conflict, must abstain from the voting. This is the core of the 27, paragraph 3. But this has not been exercised well. And also the role of the permanent members of the Security Council and also the Security Council itself to draft the plan for disarmament, arms regulation stipulated in Article 26 and Article 47 has never been exercised, never been used. And also for what purpose is the Military Staff Committee? And this must be revised and also updated to the new situation, and this could have been proposed by the Secretariat. I think this are the very concrete, the proposal, the remarks, the feeling that I have. And second is to be short, I have some concern utilizing the regional organization for peaceful or peace enforcement action. Somebody has already mentioned this. And do you want to repeat the mistakes that has been made by Mr. Gadi for about 30 years ago in trying to introduce the peace enforcement unit? It was a disaster. And would you like to do this? What is the reason why this has been proposed in the context of the African Union? Somebody has already mentioned this, so that I think further deliberation is necessary. Also, the reform, not reform, but the disarmament. This was mentioned in the paper, and I think Mr. Gadi has proposed agenda for disarmament. So this has been duly taken into consideration. And also, I would be also, proposing, like Mr. Gadi, to hold the special session of the disarmament of the General Assembly. Fourth, the special session devoted on the disarmament is urgently necessary. But this has been pointed out by this paper, so I really, try to praise this. But there are many things to be done. What about the Peace Building Commission? I think it's too weak to strengthen the role of the Peace Building Commission. It should have proposed escalating this Peace Building Commission to the Council, Peace Building Council, and divide those items that should be dealt with in the Peace Building Council should be dealt with solely in the Peace Building Council, and which this council should have a power to decide, not only make recommendation, but decide, decision making. This is only the point that is missing. And also, last point, I'm sorry. The peacemaking is very important. It is very little mentioned, but we need many peacemakers. And the United Nations must be at heart, at the center of this activities. And it should be should have been mentioned more detail. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Renato, are you there? May I give you a point of reply? I think particularly just on the first thing, that Ambassador Shinyo was Japan's permanent representative to the United Nations and very knowledgeable about in working. He says maybe Secretary General, you are a bit too modest a bit hesitant to touch upon the Security Council. What is your response, please, Renato? Just in 2 minutes, please. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. And I wish I had a little bit more time to engage on a number of criticisms. I would just encourage a lot of colleagues to read through many of the recommendations, because I think a lot of the criticisms are actually addressed in the paper. On Security Council reform, I'm not entirely sure I fully understand the criticism. I think the Secretary General in the past has made concrete proposals and formula about reform of the membership. Those proposals have not really advanced. I think the Secretary General, having considered the situation this time, realized that it is the Intergovernmental Negotiations Security Council reform that are currently taking place that is the venue for member states to discuss formula, and it's not for the Secretary General to propose how many permanent or rotating members of the council there should be in an enlarged council, for example. What he wanted to focus on, in addition to pushing for the urgency of council reform, is really the idea that council reform of the membership is not a panacea, and that there are other parts of reforms of the council's work that are necessary to address some of the challenges that the council currently faces. And so he does address, and I think Ambassador had mentioned the issue of veto. There is a specific reference in the text to the need for greater accountability for the use of veto by permanent members of Security Council. And it doesn't really refer to the specific initiatives that have put forward in the last couple of years, because those are still being discussed. But the issue of accountability for the use of veto is actually addressed in the document, but also more burden sharing amongst permanent and non-permanent members, more systematic consultation with host states ahead of the adoption of renewal mandates, etc. I actually would also point colleagues to the set of recommendations on sanctions measures. It's really a robust set of recommendations Secretary General had never put forward before, and there, as you surely know, there are current debates right now in the Council about how sanctions measures should be imposed. And the Secretary General has really put forward this idea that sanctions should be really linked to political solutions and not just seen as punitive measures. And there's a number of recommendations he puts forward in this regard. So I can't respond to the other criticisms that the document is banal, etc. I think I will just express my disagreement to those criticisms. And I think there is a certain sense of urgency regarding the current situation that the Secretary General has expressed. I think perhaps some of the challenges that colleagues have with the document is really that it tries to address issues from the perspective also of a different set of member states and what we've heard from member states themselves, and how much political willingness there is of member states to address some of those issues. Many of those challenges cannot be really addressed by action by the Secretary General. It's action by member states that need to take place to reform the Security Council, to strengthen the PBC, to strengthen the General Assembly. And so the SG is putting member states before their responsibilities.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thanks. Professor Popovsky, how do you find this? Okay.
Well, I understand that Renato is working for the Secretary General and disagree with the criticism, but we don't work for the Secretary General, so we will emphasize the criticism even further. I agree with Shinyo absolutely that this is a boring, banal business as usual. Very well said. 3B, but boring, banal business as usual. And even more than that, I'll see there is absolutely misleading title. New agenda for peace. New, I don't see anything new. Well, very little new, but the problem with new is that every time we put new in any document, you know, there is a story in Britain, in Oxford. In the 15th century, they built a college and they call it New College. And in English, there is an expression, new as New College in Oxford. Because it was new at the time, 15th century, New College in Oxford, the name remains. This is not agenda. I mean, agenda is simply plagiarism from Boutros Ghali, 1992. And there is very little about peace. Secretary General talks about security generally, and on peace is, I think, 10% of the document is about peace. Everything else is about broader agenda for security. If it was agenda for security, I would have kind of accepted it, but it's not an agenda for peace. Like I will illustrate that domestic crimes. Okay, we can talk about domestic crimes. It is a problem in many countries. There is a lot of violence, domestic violence, but these are issues for the law enforcement agency in every country. There is no peace between murderers and victims. There are sentences in courts and prisons. What is the connection between domestic violence or any crimes in a country with United Nations? How can United Nations help reducing domestic crimes? Can anybody in this room answer that? There is no environmental peace. There is environmental security. We understand, focus on that is important. There are many issues. But again, a document on peace doesn't need to worry about environmental security. Or let's take artificial intelligence and cyber crimes. You and your rector very eloquently talk about this. Cyber crimes is important, but there is no conceptual link between cyber security and cyber peace. What can United Nations do to reduce cyber crimes? Silence, very little in the document. And there is a lot of escapes. Let's national government do it. Let's regional organizations do it. Let's hope the African Union will do that and that. Let's hope European Union or NATO will do that and that. But how will United Nations help? Zero answer. A question to Renato, if he's still there. Where will the peacekeeping budget go from now on? Very little peace operations. Many people said this is the end of peacekeeping. Exactly, I agree with Shinyo-san, who said very little about peacemaking. Peacekeeping is almost gone. And what remains is prevention and peace building, which is fine. We understand that. These are important. Focus should be done on prevention. Focus should be done on peace building. But apart from saying deja vu cliche that peace building council needs to be strengthened, and everybody will agree with that, why he doesn't listen to proposals to upgrade the peace building commission into the peace building council may already set 7 years ago. The answer by Renato about the Security Council reform is ridiculous, you know. To say that accountability for the use of the veto, I think it is 60, 70 years talk about accountability for use of the veto. There is much more done by the General Assembly, by the way, with the veto initiative by Liechtenstein and others. That has been done. The Secretary General doesn't need to repeat what has been done. Of course, working methods are important, but they are also done. We have ARIA formula for many years. We invite non-members of the Security Council.
Okay, I think you are advocate of Peace Building Commission very much. And what do you think on the debate so far?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hasegawa. I really appreciate this opportunity. In fact, you remember that you and I discussed that this should be held by the GPAG. And I think this has turned out to be, I think, extremely interesting and positive opportunity. I really appreciate all these previous speakers. I appreciate Renato for briefing us well in such a short time about the background in which this new Agenda for Peace was drafted. You know, I think it's easy to criticize the document like this. Anybody or any document is susceptible to criticisms when the issue handled is so huge and so controversial. But I think that we should, as somebody had mentioned, look at it in a positive light, first of all, and see how this will pave way for actually improving the United Nations system and the way in which the international community faces the issue of management of the international order. There are many, many good points, very comprehensive points are being discussed. I particularly applaud the courageous efforts by the Secretary General to address the future-oriented issues like cyberspace, technology, and in fact, the outer space. And these are things that we have to address. But I have to be honest and say that when I finished reading, I thought I finished reading part 1 of New Agenda for Peace, and that maybe there would be part 2. And that probably should be coming, and perhaps it would be coming, based on the this New Agenda for Peace, which has just been published. It does present the opportunity for all of us to discuss the key issues in a very realistic way, in a very comprehensive manner. But I think what is needed as international civil servant like myself and civil servant for all my life is something operational. What can you make to happen, which would make a difference to the life of everybody and to the actual system of managing international order? And I think that will require much more discussion. And one thing that has to be done is to assign responsibilities clearly to the respective issues, not to just one country, maybe to countries or to the institutions or to a system, but responsibilities have to be assigned. Otherwise, no answer shall be there. So I think that is first of all, general statement that I will make. And I also acknowledge that I think it was Mr. Berg who said that maybe this is the consensus of what best you could attain rather than what he had wanted. Maybe so, but I think we should not stop there. We have to give priority to ensure that things are operational, deliverable, and will actually make a change. And that prioritized action program will have to be created with clear assignment of responsibilities. This is first point number one. The other thing that I actually would like to say is that the Secretary General has been very modest, perhaps, about the role of the United Nations as an institution. There's so much that the United Nations can still do. And I think, don't fear what the reactions of some of the key states or powers might be, but it's a document for discussion. So come out with clear indications. For instance, there is a recommendation in the HIPPO report about prevention. It talked about the creation of a standing body to constantly analyze the international situation by the Secretariat, of course, with the membership of key countries, so that we have constantly updated evaluation of what the problems are and what are the things that has to be done with the experts' knowledge and analysis of the Secretariat, but with the political support of the member states. This has not been established, unfortunately, despite the HIPPO report recommendation, but something like that, the standing institution in the United Nations, removed from the whim of the member states to analyze the issues which actually threaten the security of the global situation, is going to be helpful. So something like that can be discussed. Also, another thing that I would suggest is the PBC, which Dr. Hasegawa mentioned. Now, I have a strong view that the PBC can do a lot more. The PBC has, I attended the PBC meetings, and it's always been attended by, top person level is usually a minister, counselor, first secretaries. No, make it more politically meaningful for member states. And there should be a clear understanding with the Security Council as to what the roles each will play and respect with each other, and give, again, responsibilities, because without responsibilities, you just talk and talk. So I would stop there because I don't think I have time.
Yeah.
But my point is, please be bold about the role of United Nations institution, because they can do a lot more. And let's make this chapter 1 and let's start on chapter 2. Thank you.
Excellent suggestion. Don't to be too timid. be bold. Thank you. I will just ask others in the order of their timing of raising their hands. I think we have Mr. Gary Stukin and Wesley Massey, Professor Sugimura, and Mr. Peter Schumann. Gary Stukin, he is an epidemiologist in California. So it's now about 7:30 in the morning. And he spoke at the TED Talk called Violence is a Disease. Dr. Sturgeon, please. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Hasegawa. I'll be as brief as I possibly can. I just want to make reference to a few of the comments that have been made that I think fit into what I was intending to do in the first place. Yes, I'm an epidemiologist. I'm the founder of Cure Violence Global, and I previously worked at the World Health Organization, including leading their intervention, adaptation, and design unit. We've redesigned epidemic control to conform to preventing and stopping violence in many different situations, including militias and tribes and in conflict zones, as well as community violence. Some of the comments, I won't give them attribution and name every person that I think are really relevant to what I intend to say, is that the UN has been named an ideal organization, but in fact it isn't, because it is itself political. There's been a lot of mention of the enormous scope of the document, but that it also must be realistic. And absent of specific actions, Yorgos talks about it being theoretical and not being it. Don't pass this on to the regional. Victor mentions the rivalries and the inability to deal with conflicts or problems within states. And most importantly, I think we're missing the urgency. I think the principles are good, and of solidarity and trust and universality and so on, and they should be put into global campaigns to these principles. Now, to the issue of violence being a disease and to the importance that Mariani mentions of prevention and of violence, here's where I have to really say a couple specific things. Prevention is completely misunderstood. Prevention, in the way that we consider it at World Health and the way that I've been trained, changes the now. It is not focused about the future, maybe. It has very, very specific means, methods, tools, skills, and infrastructures and systems that stop epidemics. And violence is an epidemic disease. Violence itself is also completely misunderstood and seen as a moral problem or as a political problem rather than simply a contagious process. So what I think we're primarily missing, whether it's UN or someone else who does this in cooperation with the UN, and Dr. Berg mentions Gavi and the Global Fund, which I have worked with very closely, and I think something like this should be developed, is that the need to stop things now. And this means to work on violence directly, stopping the spread of violence directly, and not through all these other things about economics and peace building and so on are wonderful, as clean water is wonderful, but we don't always have it, but we still have to stop cholera, and we can. So what we need to do is to develop these systems and new infrastructures at the global level, at the regional level, and within countries that are standing, not ad hoc, for continuous communication with belligerents. Not ad hoc, now and then, maybe, but for the belligerents or potential belligerents for the situation that exists right now, as well as potentially, there need to be the standing up of and the hiring of or recruitment of people who have access, credibility, and trust confidentially with each of these players. And again, in a consistent, this is epidemic control network that changes the perspectives, looks for the outs, and works on it every day with intensity and continuity. And this would be at regional level, within countries, and at global level. This is epidemic control applied to violence. So the essential thing I'm saying is that we need urgency, consistency of outreach networks, and the people who have access and trust employed by either an international NGO or set of NGOs or the UN in some collaborative network. And this be applied to the most important conflicts that are occurring now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Your suggestion to develop a solid system at the global level, intensively and to continuously to work on the disease of violence. Okay, I will invite now Mr. Basil Masi is now in Ethiopia. General Masi, could you just introduce yourself in just one sentence, please? Go ahead.
Good morning and greetings to you all from Ethiopia. I'm working with UNDP as the Senior Advisor for Stabilization and Disarmament, Demobilization and Reintegration. So with this, mindful of time, I'll keep it brief. Firstly, I'll thank Professor Hasegawa and also the previous speakers for the enriched and experienced views which they have shared with us. Moving on, a new agenda for peace, I personally feel is a positive step within the present global order. And however, any policy has to lead to implementation and it should bring change like brought out by few speakers. So I will focus on peace building or peacemaking. And I think rightly brought out is that our focus of the UN should be on national institutions and capacity. But I think we must not forget the communities and people and the civil society which exists within all our programming or implementation towards this. Second is, it is very important, the timeline for supporting a peace agreement, and that relates to how soon or fast does the communities or the people in that country receive the peace dividend. And I think we do tend to undersell our own UN agencies because a lot of work has been done. And I'm glad that Jordan Ryan is here because during his time when he was in the Crisis Bureau, we had moved towards stabilization, and in many countries now we call peace support. So stabilization or peace support basically is time-bound, localized, integrated civilian program, and the primary purpose is to build trust between communities and legitimate authorities. They may be at the local, regional, provincial, or at the federal level. And they basically lay the foundation for recovery, peace building, and development programs. And also, we must not forget that the protection of human rights, gender sensitivity, transparency, and rightly brought out transparency of that anti-corruption should be incorporated and should underpin all our source. So what are the one challenge which remains for us on the ground to basically provide this peace support or to support a peace agreement is basically funding. Because any support has to be seen fast, the peace dividend has to be seen fast by the people. And like, for example, in Ethiopia, the peace agreement was signed on 2nd November of last year. And we are very soon going to touch the 1-year anniversary, and funding has not materialized. People are waiting, and Ethiopia in another region, a conflict has already started, a new conflict. And because the peace support or stabilization is a catalyst for conflicts which are going on in the region or within the country in different provinces, to provide them an incentive to negotiate and reach a political settlement. So with this, I think I'll keep it brief because we are reaching the 11 o'clock mark in Tokyo. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we have just last two speakers, and I think since Professor Sugimura will discuss on the issues, maybe can I give it to Peter Schumann first, because I think he's on the same peace and security operations. Peter, please, could you introduce yourself kindly?
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, Dr. Hasegawa, my congratulations for your initiative to organize this meeting. My apologies that I could not join the first hour, but I was stuck with a problem in Sudan. Well, I will report on this later. I have spent my entire life with UNDP, seconded more than 2 decades from UNDP to peacekeeping. So I call myself a peacekeeping practitioner. And I'm judging the so-called new agenda for peace from this perspective as a as somebody who has worked in peacekeeping for decades. And I'm judging from the point of view of the weakest of the victims, not from the point of view of the Security Council or member states living in peace and harmony, but from the position of those affected by war, so from the weakest. And there, my perspective is sort of a bit bleak. The United Nations has played a diminishing role in the most complex crisis situations over the past couple of years. Afghanistan, Sudan, Mali, now Niger, Ukraine. We don't see the United Nations at the forefront. And there are a number of reasons for this. And if I compare this with the new Agenda for Peace document, then I think it is clear why the United Nations is no longer at the forefront of sort of the most complex crisis situations we have seen. Number one, we still do not have an accountability back to the Security Council, who has issued the mandate for a peacekeeping operation, a political operation or whatever, to interfere, to assist the victims. Number two, we still have no recourse to key member states actively interfering, even undermining peacekeeping operations or peacemaking operations. The negotiations on trying to resolve the situation in Sudan are between the US, Saudi Arabia, and the military in Sudan. The civilians have absolutely no role in the negotiations taking place in Jeddah. The new Agenda for Peace will also not resolve this kind of a problem. Number three, there is no accountability to those affected by war. The civilians at risk. We still have no mechanism where we actively bring them into what we do, but it's still a top-down operation. So we have no answer how to deal with member states who have no functioning government. This is an issue which we just discussed an hour ago with Sudanese, who basically say, you from the United Nations, and they referred specifically also to the current SRSG, you always try to deal with us as if we have a government. We do not have a government. General Burhan is the leader of a military coup. He doesn't represent the government. So you from the United Nations have not yet learned, despite sort of dealing for decades in these kind of situations, how to deal with a society which does not have an accountable, responsible government. So we see that there are a number of issues which we know for a long time, but the new Agenda for Peace does not, even in a marginal sense, address these issues. I want to take this opportunity to talk to you and to bring to your attention a current situation in Sudan. You know that there is a complete collapse of state and society. We have reliable information that there are about 4 million Southern Sudanese who live in Khartoum and outskirts in Khartoum as refugees, who are massacred, who are under imminent threat, who are discriminated by the Sudan armed forces, but even more so by the rapid support forces and militia. This is an acute situation. This is why I could not join you from the beginning. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Peter, for your very insightful explanation. Okay, may I ask Professor Sugimura first, and then Mr. Kuroda for brief points. I think we should finish it in 5 minutes to 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay, Professor Sugimura, the Vice President of Sophia University, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Hasegawa, and thank you very much for giving me opportunity. I just want to mention as a concrete measure of realizing the new agenda for peace, because UNESCO has a vision for education called Futures of Education in 2021, and it emphasizes solidarity, equitable and qualitative education, and outlines the role of education realizing the SDGs vision to 2050. Last year, as you know, in 2022, Transforming a Global Summit was held during the UN General Assembly in September, where the transformation of education was also advocated. So in addition to this development, now is the United Nations discussing about the revision of 1974 recommendation titled for International Understanding, Cooperation and Peace, and Education Relating to Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. As a member of the international expert group, I shared that experiences because this recommendation now is revision, but still focusing on the peace of culture and human rights and sustainability, which are a very important topic of all of us. Today, I have already learned a lot of things from your discussion, how the UN system and how the UN diplomacy has been rethought. But from the concrete point, if we can increase opportunity of international and transnational education, which create the academic platform of the people who will think together, share the experiences for the future's peace and sustainable societies, I think it might be a very interesting point for us to realize the multilateralism, which was addressed by Secretary General, New Agenda for Peace. So thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's wonderful to have professors like Sugimura Sensei at Japanese University. We have many women who are very active now. Okay, Mr. Kuroda, please.
Thank you very much, President Hasegawa, and this very, very timely seminar, which also commemorates this 20th anniversary from the Baghdad bombing at the UN. I have 2 points. One is the how to exploit and make use of the youth. Right now, I think they will become a dominant force, and we need to find a way to bring them on board. I think the gender dimension has been stressed, but I think we need to really take advantage of youth resources going forward and to connect with them so that UN can stay relevant. A second point is having looked at the World Bank, over the last 20 years, the bank has made enormous progress in the context of peace, conflict prevention, and in these areas, and they know something about financing. So I would hope that there's the collaboration ongoing now with the World Bank and IMF will be further strengthened so that they can contribute more to this agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think before we conclude our discussion, I think we should be fair to give another opportunity to Renato. I think if you are still with us, just for 5 minutes to respond to some of the statement made. Renato?
Professor Hasegawa, I think Mr. Mariani has already left.
Okay, fine. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, that gives me to just conclude our discussion, and I would like to just highlight 3 points that I learned from you all. First one, I think you have all emphasized the difference in the environment and the circumstances that made Boutros Boutros-Ghali to issue new agenda for peace, as explained by Mr. Akashi, and also what the Guterres has now issued this new agenda for peace. And I think there is one important element there is there was in fact sort of emerging consensus on the universal values and the principles for the governance at that time in the 1990s to going to 2000 in the form of a liberal democracy. And I, as one of the SRSG, worked on that faithfully to create the society that is just and fair to its citizens. Whereas now we have no consensus on the basic values, what should be in fact guarded. And here I think we need to find a way to build that basic foundation for the global governance. Second point, many of you mentioned about the leadership. And I think leadership requires not only the managerial leadership, but also visionary and very assertive leadership that should deal with not only the familiar problems that we are facing, but global in nature. I think Professor Rector Marwara pointed out so well about the danger of AI technology. And also, I think Professor Zhu Guihong mentioned in this regard the efficacy of addressing these global threats rather than regional and then maybe domestic conflicts. Thirdly, that I think we learned a lot from you, myself. That's the most important point. I think, in fact, Ambassadors Shinyo and Yamamoto represented what Giorgio Kostakos, Robert Berg, Kirsten Leitner, and others mentioned. That the report is short of very concise and detailed proposition on what to be done and how it should be done. That the problems are described, but not clearly analyzed in depth, and no solutions on how to go about is in need of further clarifications. So these are the 3 points that I learned from you, and I thank you for your participation from United States so early in the morning, and for the Japanese participants so late at night. And I would like to now request Professor Kumagai to make a very short announcement on what to come.
Yes,
Professor
thank you very much.
Kumagai, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Hasegawa. First of all, I'd like to make an apology for the mistake I made. Actually, I introduced Mr. Jordan Ryan as Vice President for Peace Program at the Carter Center, but Mr. Ryan has already retired from the Carter Center. I'm sorry for the misinformation. And now I'd like to have the announcement about the upcoming annual Tokyo Peace Building Forum to be held on Saturday, 25th of November 2023. This is a hybrid session. I hope you can come to Tokyo to join us or to participate online. The detailed program for this forum will be announced shortly. In this forum, we will invite Mr. Mitoji Yabunaka, former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, as keynote speaker. Thank you very much for your attention and thank you very much for your participation. I wish you have a good day, good evening, and good afternoon. Thank you very much.